Hello, class. I want to welcome you to our final day of new content. We've finally gotten through all of how we write that we're going to be reading. You'll probably never have to read it again. I doubt any other teacher's going to assign it. And what we've got here for the last couple of days of class is something of a treat in terms of how much it has to offer us. We've got the poem To His Coy Mistress by Andrew Marvell. Marvell, chronologically, he's the latest of the poets that we've been reading in class, with the exception of Pat Mora, where we started. Um, a lot of the poetry we've read has followed a more or less chronological timeline, going from Marlowe, Raleigh, Donne, and now Marvell, who's born about a decade before Donne dies. And Marvell dies, I think, around 1680, somewhere thereabout. The the poem gives us a lot to work with. There's also some interesting things about Marvell's life that we need to talk about. Um, he there's a lot that's not known about him. Uh, he went off to college at a young age. He was the secretary for John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, which some people consider it the greatest epic written in the English language. I think that's perhaps not entirely wrong, but there's something kind of disingenuous in that it implies that there's quite a few epics in the English language, and there really aren't. English hasn't engaged in the epic traditions like a lot of the others. That may also kind of be be a claim that could be contended with something like Derek Walcott's Omeros from '92. Marvell, he was secretary for Milton, so after Milton had gone blind and was dictating parts of Paradise Lost, it's possible that quite a bit of the poem was actually transcribed by Marvell. The two of them were very close. Marvell seems to have disappeared around the civil war years in England. So, with the Commonwealth and the rise of Cromwell's government, it seems that Marvell had gone off to the continent. He's probably spending a lot of time in France, maybe even Italy, and doing some of his writing from there. Still writing in English and for England. He came back to the country when Charles II was instated as king and the monarchy reinstated. Marvell was one of those who was not executed because he agreed to support the new government, even though he'd been a staunch Republican in the English sense prior to that. So Marvell has a long history of playing both sides of a debate. His sense of self preservation is very strong. He's also instrumental in keeping Charles II's government from executing John Milton, who wrote some very inflammatory publications under his own name. Marvell wrote his prose anonymously, and his political tracts were anonymous. So it was more difficult to trace them back to him. His poetry spans a really wide range in scope. There's some satires, there's some religious works, there's romance or failed romance, depending on how we want to characterize it, like what we've read for today. What's interesting about the poem that we have for today, it's not remembered as a failed seduction poem or necessarily a romance poem like some of the others we've talked about. You may remember we started with Passionate Shepherd, and we talked about whether or not that was romance. And I think it was written with the intent of being a romance, whether or not that might have been naive or misguided, as we've discussed in class, and as the responses point out. Coy Mistress is a Carpe Diem poem. So it's not, despite the high style, um, and it is some of the kind of high points of eloquence in the English language. It's got this high style, it's got some lovely imagery, it's got some shocking, painful, disgusting, and violent imagery also, but it's not a love poem, it's a Carpe Diem poem. It's all about seize the day. And that may or may not help you while interpreting this later. But since it is a complex poem, what I'm going to do are a couple of explication videos that break down sections of the poem and then talk about it as a whole. So, those are what the other videos are going to be. And then I'm curious to see what your responses are, what you found while reading this, and how this relates to some of the other things we've been talking about all semester. So, uh, what arguments is it making? How is it trying to make its arguments? What is it doing to be persuasive? What are the techniques that the author's using? Um, do we think this is satire or serious? Right, because that becomes one of those questions that we have to ask: is the speaker serious when he says these inflammatory things to the woman, or is this making fun of the type of person or the traditions in literature that support it? So I'll be interested to see your thoughts on those.